There is an island in the Caribbean where the sun always shines, and yet shadows linger. A place where billionaires once walked freely, where the gates closed behind them, and the world outside seemed to vanish. On this island, secrets were currency, silence was enforced, and the powerful played by rules no one else could see. Today the island sits quietly, its beaches empty, its villas abandoned, but the questions it raises are far from settled. What really happened there? Who controlled the truth? And why, even now, does the world still hesitate to look too closely? Tonight we step into that silence. We trace the footprints left behind, and we confront a system built to hide what it does not want revealed. Chapter 1: The Island of Shadows. The Caribbean sun burns evenly across thousands of islands, but one of them feels colder than the rest. For decades, Little St. James was a name buried in property filings and travel records, a speck of land surrounded by blue. It was only later, after police lights, after raids, after the headlines, that the world began to ask what had really happened there. The island's story begins in 1998. A private purchase. 70-odd acres. The kind of real estate deal that rarely draws attention. A rich man buys a piece of paradise. But this buyer was no ordinary man. He had already begun weaving a network that stretched from Wall Street to royal palaces. To those who knew him, he seemed effortlessly connected, an operator whose phone never stopped ringing. Little St. James became the jewel of his world. Helicopters landed on manicured lawns. Guards patrolled the beaches. Locals ferried supplies but rarely stayed long. The island, surrounded by coral and calm seas, appeared tranquil. Yet visitors described a sense of unease, an architecture of surveillance and secrecy. Cameras watched from tree lines. Ghost houses sat behind coded locks. In public, the man cultivated charm. In private, he cultivated control. And control required isolation. The island offered that perfectly. Anyone arriving knew they were cut off from everything. No easy escape, no witnesses, no press. It was here that a pattern of manipulation deepened. The details, now recorded in court filings, spoke of exploitation hidden behind philanthropy, of invitations that seemed professional but led to coercion. Each account pointed to a system built not on chance but design, a pyramid where power flowed upward and silence trickled down. For years, rumors drifted across the Caribbean like fog. Locals whispered about powerful guests, about flights that arrived under cover of darkness. Nothing could be proven, no one wanted to push. When money and status collide with fear, truth becomes negotiable. On the surface, the island flourished. Renovations, parties, charitable donations, all of it reinforcing a public facade of success. But beneath the marble and the manicured lawns lay something brittle. The illusion that wealth equals safety. The belief that power erases accountability. By the mid-2000s, the facade began to crack. Investigators in Florida followed complaints that led toward the man's private world. The first wave of witnesses spoke hesitantly, as though expecting disbelief. Yet their stories aligned too closely to ignore. Still, the system hesitated. Agreements were signed behind closed doors. Files were sealed. Justice bent. On the island, life went on as though nothing had happened. For a time, it seemed that secrecy had won again. Money changed hands, connections tightened. The press moved on. And the sea kept lapping against the island's shore, patient as ever. Then something shifted. The cultural tide was turning. Whispers turned to questions, questions to investigations. Names once untouchable began appearing in print. And yet, every revelation led only deeper into confusion. Why had it taken so long? How had so many looked away? When federal agents finally stepped onto Little St. James in 2019, they found a place frozen between opulence and emptiness. Bedrooms stripped bare. Safes pried open. Computers missing. A silence thick enough to hear the waves echo off concrete. One agent later described it as walking through a crime scene that had cleaned itself. Evidence was partial, the truth fragmented. But something larger had already emerged. The realization that the island was never just a setting. It was an operating principle, a physical manifestation of how secrecy protects power. Every photograph of the island, its blue and gold dome, its winding paths, its luxury villas, became an emblem. To the public, it symbolized exploitation. To investigators, obstruction. To survivors, trauma. To the powerful, a warning. As night fell over the Caribbean, the island stood quiet again. Tourists passing by on yachts saw only an empty estate fading into dusk. But beneath that stillness, questions pulsed like a heartbeat. Who built the system that allowed this to happen? Who benefited? And what would it take to tear that system down? The investigation was only beginning. Files opened. Names surfaced. The island's gates had finally been forced ajar. But in the corridors of influence, far from the Caribbean heat, another kind of defense was already forming. Not of walls and cameras, but of lawyers, allies, and silence. And as that silence thickened, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was never about one man. It was about the network that protected him. Chapter 2: The System That Protects Power. When investigators step into corruption, they rarely find monsters hiding in caves. They find paperwork, contracts, phones switched off at the right moment. Systems so ordinary they almost look harmless. What people call a cover-up isn't usually one dramatic act. It's 1,000 small silences aligning perfectly. In the years that followed the exposure of the island, journalists traced a pattern older than the scandal itself. A pattern that repeats whenever wealth, secrecy, and institutions meet. A private fund that launders reputation through charity. A law firm that specializes in sealing records. A media outlet that trades access for silence. None of these pieces look illegal on their own. Together, they form the architecture of impunity. The same blueprint appears everywhere power concentrates. In corporate boards that bury internal reports. In governments that classify embarrassment as national security. In cultural industries that reward complicity with promotion. This is the invisible network, the system that protects power. When the first wave of revelations broke, observers expected collapse. Reputations shattered, alliances broken, justice delivered. But what came instead was adaptation. The network absorbed the shock. It adjusted, rebranded, survived. Lawyers argued that memories were unreliable. Commentators warned against witch hunts. Politicians distanced themselves, then moved on. The news cycle spun, then stopped. The island faded from front pages, but the questions it raised remained unanswered. How could so many agencies fail for so long? How did the wealthy learn to use the very tools of transparency, public filings, charities, trusts, as shields? The answers lie not in one conspiracy, but in a culture that confuses influence with innocence. In Washington, lobbying shapes oversight. In London, defamation law discourages journalists from naming names. In offshore havens, anonymity is a service sold by the hour. This web doesn't need coordination. It operates on shared instinct. Protect the powerful, question the powerless. Whistleblowers describe it as walking into fog. One moment you see the truth clearly, the next it's gone, replaced by no comment, by closed doors, by emails that never arrive. And yet every so often a fragment escapes. A flight log, a leaked memo, a survivor's testimony. Enough to remind the public that the system isn't invincible, just persistent. For investigators, each clue raises a darker realization. The network doesn't end with the individuals who fall. It regenerates through those who watched and did nothing. The financier who arranges donations to an art museum. The official who delays an inquiry until the outrage cools. The citizen who clicks away because the story feels uncomfortable. Power survives through participation, willing or not. In quiet offices around the world, compliance officers, editors, and bureaucrats perform tiny calculations. Is this worth the risk? Will speaking up change anything? Most decide no. And with that, the system endures another day. There's another reason accountability stalls. Memory fatigue. Scandals pile up until outrage becomes background noise. The public forgets. Institutions wait for exactly that. The tactic is older than any modern case. Let time do what money cannot. Years later, documentaries, podcasts, and social threads try to reconstruct what happened. But each attempt runs into the same wall. Evidence missing, files sealed, witnesses afraid. The truth exists, but only in fragments, and fragments rarely convict. Still, something shifted after the island. People saw the pattern. They recognized that secrecy isn't an accident, it's policy. Activists began pushing for transparency laws. Reporters formed cross-border coalitions to track hidden wealth. Survivors of various abuses started finding each other online, realizing that their experiences, though separate, shared the same scaffolding of neglect and denial. The system noticed too. It responded with distraction. New scandals, new narratives, fresh outrage cycles to dilute the old. But beneath the noise, a question kept returning, whispered in comment sections, repeated in late-night conversations. If this could stay hidden for so long, what else is still hidden? Every time an institution resists transparency, it feeds that question. Every unanswered subpoena, every redacted document, every mysteriously delayed investigation becomes another piece of evidence. Not against one man, but against a structure that protects him. The system defends itself not through violence but through procedure. It slows everything down until outrage decays into paperwork. Trials postponed. Hearings rescheduled. Settlements negotiated. Justice stretched until it becomes abstract. And yet each delay leaves a trace, a sense of unease that ordinary citizens can feel even if they don't know the details. That's the quiet power of corruption. It teaches people to expect disappointment. But expectation can shift. Once an audience learns the rhythm of deception, silence sounds louder than denial. Investigators now watch for that silence. The sudden withdrawal of coverage, the missing photograph, the interview that never airs. Each absence tells its own story. The island may have been raided, sold, forgotten in headlines. But the system that built it still hums beneath the surface, invisible yet intact. And somewhere, files remain locked, drives remain missing, testimonies remain sealed, waiting for a moment when exposure outweighs risk. Because if the island represented secrecy made visible, then what comes next may be worse. Secrecy that learned to hide in plain sight. Chapter 3: The Echo That Won't Die. Years have passed since the headlines faded. Little St. James sits quietly in the Caribbean sun, the waves lapping at its private shores as though nothing ever happened. But the silence is deceptive. Silence does not erase memory. Silence does not erase consequence. Silence only postpones judgment. The island became myth. Photographs circulate online, aerial shots of blue water and golden sand, the domed structure rising like a monument to secrecy. To the untrained eye, it is merely paradise. To those who study it, it is a reminder, a warning, of how systems of power endure. Even after arrests, even after death, even after lawsuits, the echo of the events lingers. In legal filings, in redacted documents, in survivor testimonies. Fragments of truth scatter like debris in the tide. And the network, the machinery of secrecy, continues to hum. Perhaps it has evolved. Perhaps it has learned. Perhaps it thrives quietly, not in fear, but in the patience of institutions, of bureaucracies, of society itself. One lesson emerges from these echoes. Power protects itself not with force alone, but with structure, with procedure, with invisibility. The island, stripped bare of its scandal, is only one piece of a much larger system. Investigators have pieced together fragments, guest lists, flight logs, legal settlements, offshore accounts. And yet, the complete picture remains elusive. Every revelation seems to lead to another layer of questions. Who else benefited? Who else remained silent? What other networks exist beyond public scrutiny? The answer is not comforting. The mechanisms that allowed such secrecy to flourish are not unique to one individual, one island, or one event. They exist wherever influence, money, and fear converge. The public may believe the story ended with arrests or death, but the echo persists. In financial statements, in law offices, in executive boardrooms, the same principles that cloaked the island in invisibility remain in operation. And each new generation encounters it, sometimes unknowingly, sometimes aware, sometimes complicit. Awareness becomes the first weapon. Attention becomes the first act of accountability. And here is the final, unnerving truth. The echo will not die so long as silence persists, so long as the powerful can rely on fear and discretion to shield themselves. Yet there is hope. The systems that protect power are not infallible. They bend under scrutiny. They crack under sustained investigation. They are human-made and therefore imperfect. Documentaries, investigative journalists, whistleblowers, and survivors, each creates a ripple. Each challenges the illusion of invulnerability. The echo of Little St. James has reminded the world that even the most entrenched secrecy can be exposed, analyzed, questioned. And so the story does not end on the island. It continues wherever people choose to look, to ask, to challenge. Wherever transparency is demanded. Wherever silence is refused. The island may lie in the sun, empty and serene. But its lessons reverberate. They linger in the minds of investigators, in the work of journalists, in the growing awareness of the public. They echo. And the echo will not die. Little St. James is a place, yes, but it is also a mirror. A reflection of how power can evade accountability, how secrecy can persist, how silence can protect. The story of the island is not just a story of one man or one crime. It is a story of society, of structures, of vigilance, or the lack thereof. And if we do not listen to the echo, if we do not examine the systems that allowed it, the cycle will continue, elsewhere, tomorrow, under new names, in new places, until attention returns. For those who dare to look closer, the message is clear. Power may hide, secrecy may shield, but truth, fragmented though it may be, never truly disappears. The island may be quiet, the villas empty, and the headlines faded, but the echoes remain. Secrets, silence, and power never disappear. They only shift, waiting for someone to look closer. If you want to follow the trail, uncover the structures that protect the untouchable, and confront the truths most would rather ignore, subscribe. Turn on notifications. Because some stories don't end when the cameras turn off. They only end when the world refuses to look away.